I'm Amy Jenkins. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Psychology at Swansea University in South Wales. My clinical, research and academic experience has all been in neuropsychology and predominantly neurodegeneration. The talk today that I'm going to be presenting is going to be on an area of my PhD that I am very passionate about, and that's about the transfer of scientific evidence into clinical practice. Alzheimer's disease. It is the main cause of dementia, accounting for approximately 70% of all cases. By 2050, this figure is going to triple. If you think about it, with this number of people tripling by 2050, we are likely then to see increases in people experiencing milder forms of cognitive impairment. Alzheimer's disease is insidious, and often the first signs to occur will happen when the disease is already very well established. And this can be at a time when somebody might be experiencing something called mild cognitive impairment, MCI. MCI is when a person experiences subtle changes in their cognitive functioning, but it can be measured. There are many causes for MCI. Some of these causes could be reversible. It could be things like anxiety, depression, and they are reversible reasons for their cognitive impairment. But for some people, they could be displaying the very early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. However, by the time somebody reaches the point of mild cognitive impairment, they will already have irreversible damage to their brain. So doesn't it seem logical that we should be looking even earlier in the progressive pathway? My research is focused on an area called subjective cognitive impairment, SCI. SCI is when a person subjectively experiences cognitive difficulties with, for example, their memory and their thinking skills. Now, we all experience SCI at some point. I certainly do, when I am stressed or I've had very little sleep. But my research is trying to distinguish between those who have very little to be worried about, which is the vast majority, compared to those that could be displaying the very early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. The problem we've got with SCI currently is that there is no objective or measurable evidence to be able to identify it confidently. What we mean by subjective is that it is subjective to that person. So they could go to a memory clinic, they could have a full battery of cognitive assessments, but none of them are able to pick up those very subtle early changes. As I said previously, not everybody with SCI, for example, will go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. But what my research is trying to highlight is that people with SCI, they might not necessarily be on that pathway to Alzheimer's disease, but they could be experiencing SCI for a whole manner of other reasons. Again, for example, like anxiety, depression, stress. These are reversible causes. These are things that we can work with. But sometimes they are not picked up and they can impact on somebody's health and well-being. SCI has been found in past research to be a risk factor for MCI. MCI has been found to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So it certainly does seem logical to be looking right at those early stages of SCI to try and identify Alzheimer's disease much, much earlier, while cognitive functioning is still at a high level. A major part of my research looks at the characterization of SCI. But my work, I am determined to be able to have that clinical link, that translational value of my research into a clinical setting. SCI is very much acknowledged in the research arena, but it's not so much, it's not really that acknowledged in clinical settings yet. It is a controversial subject, So I found it imperative to try and find out what is going on in the memory teams throughout the UK. I wanted to ask questions like, what happens for a person when they present at a clinic with SCI? What are the things that actually happen for that person? What are the pathways that are there and available for that person? And what do people know about it? I carried out 2 service evaluation studies in order to find out the answers to those questions. In my first study, the Royal College of Psychiatrists very kindly sent out an email for me to all of their registered memory teams. And then another email went out to many other teams within Wales. As part of this email, there was a hypothetical vignette of a person, a fictitious person, experiencing signs and symptoms of SCI. That person, Mr. X, was experiencing these changes in his cognitive functioning, but no measures were able to pick that up. As part of that vignette, there were open and closed questions. Unfortunately, we did only have a 21% response rate, but I found this to be a result in itself. It could very well be due to workload pressure or issue salience. It could be that it just isn't enough of an important topic to be able to put the time aside to be able to answer those questions. The responses were analysed, and I came up with 4 main themes and their respective sub-themes. The first main theme identified was that action by the memory teams was very much dependent on certain things. For example, they wanted to find out what their functioning ability was like before the testing, how their education levels actually matched up to their functioning as well. The second theme we identified was that they would want to try and find out further information about that person. For example, they really wanted to have an informant interview as well to find out if the informant actually seen these changes as well for that person. And third, the theme was that there were different outcomes for everyone, every team. There was so much disparity with the outcomes for every team that we actually had a response from. It was highly variable. For example, one person in one area would have a full comprehensive assessment, but then somebody in another area wouldn't even have been accepted into the memory clinic in the first place. And lastly were the barriers that these memory teams actually face. For example, resources. They have a lack of resources, so money, staff, such important things, but the resources just aren't there to be able to handle this volume of people. And other memory teams, for example, had shared protocols with primary care. Where are we now? Well, as I've pointed out, there was high variability in the results that we found. This variability could be due to the barriers, due to individual differences, due to the resources available. This heterogeneity in the responses that we found is not deemed the best practice. It needs addressing to ensure that we are following the best continuity of care that we can. From this research study, we identified 3 key messages. The first one was that a thorough investigation should be carried out on anybody really anxious about that there's changes actually happening for them, so that we can try and pick up those subtle changes, or that we can identify those reversible causes so that they can be treated for those. The second thing is that we are to use the term SCI. In order to use that term SCI, we are increasing people's familiarity with the term and being able to foster further research projects in order to understand that we're all looking at the same thing. And thirdly, the consistency in the treatment and management of people with SCI is desirable, And I'm saying desirable because I am well aware of the challenges and the barriers that memory teams face. It's not something that sometimes is a lot of the time in their control. The second study I carried out because I always want to know more. I wanted to find out if this was actually the representative of the memory teams within the UK. I wanted to know more in-depth information. So again, the Royal College of Psychiatrists very kindly sent out another email to all their registered memory teams, asking them if anybody would be happy to be interviewed one-to-one with me over the telephone. And obviously the memory teams within Wales also received the same email. The interviews were transcribed verbatim and I applied thematic analysis to them. 5 main themes and their respective sub-themes were identified. The first theme was knowledge of subjective cognitive impairment. Again, there were so many differences between how one person viewed it compared to another. 8 teams were interviewed. So you can imagine there was quite a lot of disparity between the 8. Some were quite honest in saying that they knew very, very little about SCI, whereas others knew spot on exactly what it was. The second theme represented the challenges, again, that people face. For example, resources again came up. People found it very difficult to identify SCI. They felt that there's not much we can do for them. So that was the second main theme. The third main theme was called management. Again, vast differences between how one team managed it compared to another. For example, as I said earlier, some people would have a full assessment, full comprehensive assessment. Somebody else may have a screening tool in order to decide whether or not they would get that full assessment. And then another team would say, screening is just not enough. If we are struggling to be able to identify those subtle changes with a full battery of a comprehensive measure, how are we going to pick it up with a screening tool? The fourth main theme represented the outcomes for people. Again, the disparity was the same as in study 1. So, for example, some were just discharged if no problems were actually identified. Others were all told that every single person that has a full comprehensive assessment will be followed up at least once, even if it's with a phone call. The fifth theme, I asked them what their suggestions would be for the future, how their team might be able to handle these changes in numbers for the future. Some said that they would like to be able to increase the amount of screening that actually happens in primary care at a GP level, or to use junior members of staff to do the screening. Other clinics also then said, well, no, we need to maintain the quality of our assessment process. As I've just pointed out, these themes are very similar to study 1. There is vast heterogeneity in how SEI is seen and managed. As you can see, these 3 messages that I mentioned in study 1, the 3 key messages, are equally as valid from study 2. So firstly, a thorough investigation needs to be carried out. Screening is not enough. Screening will not pick up those early signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, or it will not pick up those reversible reasons for why somebody might be experiencing SCI. Secondly, the SCI should be used as a term. So we need to improve people's knowledge and understanding of what the term is, and in order to use SCI to promote further research. And thirdly, that a consistent approach should be used for the treatment and the management of people with SCI. We are well aware and very conscious of the workload pressures and the challenges that the memory teams and primary care face. But we really should be trying to address that heterogeneity and to ensure continuity of care. Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you found it informative. If you'd like to know more information, please visit my website.